Now let's move on to look at the muscles. We'll build our understanding pretty much from the inside to the outside. First, we'll look at the deepest muscles, the ones that go from the scapula to the humerus. Then we'll look at the ones which go from the trunk to the scapula. And lastly, we'll look at the big three muscles on the outside which cover up almost all the others. Before we look at any shoulder muscles, we need to take note of the tendons of two long elbow muscles which arise very close to the shoulder joint and lie deep to everything else. They're the tendons of the long head of the biceps and the long head of the triceps muscles. The long head of triceps arises here from the infraglenoid tubercle. The long head of biceps arises, surprisingly, here from the supraglenoid tubercle. To get there, it passes inside the joint capsule and right over the top of the head of the humerus. Now let's look at the four short muscles which hold the shoulder joint together. There are three on the back, one on the front. The one on the front is subscapularis. It arises from almost all of the anterior or costal aspect of the scapula. Its tendon inserts here on the lesser tubercle. Subscapularis, acting alone, produces internal rotation of the humerus. Acting with the other three short muscles, it holds the humeral head and the glenoid fossa together, while other more powerful muscles are at work. On the back, there are two muscles below the scapular spine and one above it. The one above is supraspinatus. It arises from almost all of the supraspinous fossa. It passes under the acromion and inserts here on the greater tubercle. The tendon of supraspinatus runs through a tight spot between the acromion and the head of the humerus. There's a synovial-lined pocket, a bursa, here between it and the acromion. Supraspinatus initiates abduction of the humerus. The two muscles below the spine are infraspinatus and teres minor. Between them they arise from almost all of the infraspinous fossa. Infraspinatus here, teres minor here. Infraspinatus inserts here on the back of the greater tubercle, teres minor just below it. Both these muscles produce external rotation of the humerus. These four short muscles, subscapularis, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor, converge on the humerus to form an almost continuous cuff of flat supporting tendons, often referred to as the rotator cuff. It's these tendons, together with the long head of the triceps down here, which keep the head of the humerus from sliding out of its very shallow socket. There are two other muscles to note that also run from the scapula to the humerus, one on the front and one on the back. The one on the back is teres major. It arises here from the lower lateral border of the scapula and inserts here on the crest of the lesser tubercle. Teres major is quite a powerful adductor of the humerus. On the front, here's coracobrachialis. It arises from the coracoid process. It inserts down here on the humerus. Coracobrachialis helps to flex the shoulder joint. Altogether, there are 7 muscles that go from the scapula to the humerus, and so far we've seen 6 of them. The last one, the deltoid, is so big that it covers up almost everything else, so we'll leave it out of the picture till the very end. Now it's time to look at the muscles which hold the scapula in place and move it in relation to the trunk. There are 6 of them, 4 on the back, 1 in the front, and 1 underneath. The one on the underneath is the large and powerful serratus anterior muscle. This is just part of it. To see it all, we need to move the scapula away from the body. This big expansive muscle is all serratus anterior. It arises from the side and front of the first 8 ribs. It runs back under the scapula, and it's inserted all the way back here along the medial border of the scapula. When the whole serratus anterior muscle contracts, it pulls the scapula forward around the rib cage. That's protrusion. When its upper or lower fibers contract separately, they help to produce downward or upward rotation of the scapula. Now let's look at those 4 muscles on the back. 1, the trapezius, is large and superficial. The other 3 are small and deep. The 3 deep ones are levator scapulae and the 2 rhomboids, rhomboid minor and rhomboid major. Levator scapulae arises here on the outermost point of the first 3 cervical vertebrae. It inserts here on the upper medial corner of the scapula. Levator scapulae helps to elevate the scapula. The rhomboids arise here from the 4th cervical to the 5th thoracic vertebrae. They insert here along the medial border of the scapula. The rhomboids elevate and retract the scapula. The large muscle which overlies these 3 is the trapezius. It's a beautiful but complicated muscle. The trapezius has an upper part and a lower part, which both converge on the spine of the scapula. The upper part of trapezius arises from the occiput, and from the nuchal ligament, and from T1 to T3 in the midline. It's inserted along the upper edge of the spine of the scapula, around the acromion, and along the lateral third of the clavicle. The lower part of the trapezius muscle is not so massive. It arises from T4 to T12 in the midline. It inserts here on the lower edge of this part of the spine of the scapula. When the whole of trapezius contracts, it powerfully retracts the scapula. When the upper part contracts, it powerfully elevates the scapula. Last on the list of muscles passing from the trunk to the scapula is the one on the front. It's pectoralis minor. Pectoralis minor arises between the 2nd and the 4th ribs. It's inserted on the coracoid process. Pectoralis minor produces depression of the scapula. There are 2 very small muscles to mention just for completeness. One is subclavius, which goes from the 1st rib to the clavicle. Its function is uncertain. The other is omohyoid, which arises from the hyoid bone way up here and inserts over here on the upper edge of the spine of the scapula. Its function is to depress the hyoid bone and the larynx.